Greetings. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to people of goodwill. So I just stumbled across this thread, which is nearly a year old. It's from July 18th of 2023. So just in about 4 days, this thread will be a year old. But looking at it now, I felt that there was an interesting exchange in the comment section of this thread, and I thought it was worth documenting and discussing, hence this short video which is going to look at it. So first, I'm going to read through the post at the start of this thread, and then I want to look at an exchange in the comment section, as I said. So jumping right in, this thread, it starts with a post by Rav Mordecai ben Avraham, a public post on Facebook, and he writes the following, quote, "This is probably one of the most important moments in African-American history. A friend and colleague, Rabbi Yehonatan Elazar DeMota, head of the International Jewish Court and professor at Antwerp University in Belgium, is meeting with the elders of the Igbo community in Nigeria, explaining the historical and anthropological connections between the Igbo people and the 12 tribes of Israel. In 2014, there was a ruling by Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky of blessed memory, authenticating the relationship between the Igbo tribe in Nigeria with the biblical 12 tribes of Israel." Really quick note here, if I can interject. Regarding there being a ruling by Chaim Kanievsky, I'm not sure if the author of this post is referring to a specific document, like a written psak din, or if he's just referring to a video which had been floating around social media in which some Jews were having a very short impromptu conversation with a very elderly Kanievsky, in which they give him like literally a minute-long introduction to 21st century Jewish practice amongst the Igbo, and then Kanievsky shares his sort of, off-the-cuff opinion.
בתי כנסת בניגריה, בתי כנסת גדולים ביותר.
הוא נמצא בארץ ישראל.
אני נמצא בארץ ישראל, אבל
יש שם 55 בתי כנסיות, שם, באיפה שהכושים גרים.
אפריקה.
באפריקה.
והם אומרים שהם שייכים לשבטים.
הם אומרים שהם שייכים לעשרת השבטים.
זה אומר שהם עושים בריס מילה, והם עושים שבס. יש להם מקווה.
יש להם ספר תורה.
ספר תורה.
זה בית כנסת מגן אברהם. אבל יש להם פה בית כנסת מגן אברהם.
יש להם ספר תורה מגביל. גבילים.
יש להם, הם טוענים שהם משבט אפרים, שבט גד, וממש שומרים תורה ומצוות כמונו. רק מה, הם מוכנים להתגייר.
מה שמוכנים להתגייר?
הם מוכנים להתגייר, והשאלה שלנו האם בכלל לעזור להם או לדחות אותם.
השאלה היא לעזור להם או לדחות אותם.
גיור לחומרה.
גיור לחומרה.
הם מוכנים לעשות גיור לחומרה.
אז לעזור להם?
כן. כן.
Now, if there's some other document, if there's like a written psak din that Kanievsky produced, I would love to look it over. But if the ruling that this Facebook post is referring to is just that short conversation that you saw, I'd honestly, and with all due respect, I'd be reluctant to invest too much gravity into that, as depicting it as a rabbinic ruling. But whatever the case, jumping back in, he says, "Why are conversations and rabbinic rulings significant to African Americans? Most historians unanimously agree that out of the 1.7 million slaves sold from the west of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, 1.3 million of those slaves were Igbo Jews." Now, if I can interject here really quickly, I just want to say that that's, with all due respect, that it seems like a bit of an overstatement. It's one thing to say that Igbos made a significant contribution to the population that was brought over in the transatlantic slave trade, but it's quite a different thing to say that most historians agree that there were Jews. Like this, the way this is worded, now maybe he wrote it quickly and didn't intend to write it this way, but the way it's written, it seems to be stating that most historians agree that 1 million Jews were brought over from West Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. That, I really don't think that's the case, that most historians agree on that. But whatever the case, let's move on. He says, "This is a vital part to African American history, and for some reason, it has been removed from the American historical narrative of black people. The education of the beauty of Jewish diversity, specifically in the area of the African American experience, has to be introduced and standardized in the North American education system as a form of social justice and the celebration of diversity. The information of the Jewish experience throughout Africa, expressed in an educational context, will dispel a lot of anti-Semitism. Also, it will lead to the reestablishing of the close, long relationship the African American and Jewish communities in North America have shared historically. Keep in mind, my argument is not that black Americans are descendants of the 12 tribes, as black is now a pop culture phrase people of color all over the world use for self-identification, but rather there were over 1 million Igbo Jews who were descendants of the 12 tribes sold into North America during the transatlantic slave trade. It's the lack of Jewish education around Jewish diversity which is leading to much of the anti-Semitism in the world today. The enemies of Israel are convincing the world in a time of economic disparity that Jews are a white elitist race collaborating with the rest of the world elites. Anyone living in Israel can attest that Jews come in all shapes and colors and have been singled out, abused by the majority almost on every continent in the world for being minorities. It doesn't matter what color or religious observance level the Jew is. As a collective, they have been victims of anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, leading to murders and violent abuse for thousands of years. The truth shall set us free. And then he tags close to 90 people. And then he shares this video from the Association of Jewish Faith Incorporated, which has Rabbi DeMota in Nigeria. But what I wanted to get into was this thread in the comments section, and it's a sub-thread that starts with a comment from Sheis Rishon. And for those who don't know who Sheis Rishon is, he's also known as MaNishtana on social media. For years now, he's been fairly active on social media. Also, he's the gentleman in this picture, which is a fairly famous picture. It seems to come up quite a bit online in conversations about black Jews. And so he's a gentleman living in New York who's of West African descent and who's also rabbinically Jewish. If I'm not mistaken, he's Orthodox Jewish. But jumping right into this subthread, Sheis Rishon writes, historians agree that 1.3 million of those slaves were Igbo, but not all Igbo tribes are Jewish. And then there's a comment from Yehonatan Elazar DeMota. That's what the Hebrew text is. That's his name just in Hebrew characters. And he writes, Sheis Rishon, have you come to Igbo land before? And Sheis Rishon writes, I have not, and I'm referencing inter-Igbo historical narratives for my statement, particularly ones that arose in the wake of Remi Ilona's work in the early aughts. And Rabbi DeMota says, all right. Then Rav Mordecai ben Avraham comments, he says, Sheis Rishon, over the centuries there have been Igbo people who have been converted to Christianity and Islam. Nevertheless, Igbo's roots are 100% descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. This phenomenon is not exclusive to Igbos. It exists all over the world, with Jews assimilating through war, conquest, and other scenarios. And then Mordecai ben Avraham tags Remi Ilona, and he says, thoughts on what was said? So that was nearly a year ago, about 51 weeks ago. And unfortunately, Remi Ilona never participated in the thread. I wish he had. It would have been interesting to see his contributions on this. But whatever the case, then Rav Mordecai ben Avraham tags Susanna Heschel, if I'm not mistaken. She's a relative of Joshua Heschel, the famous scholar. Mordecai ben Avraham writes, Professor, this is one of the academic initiatives I would love to talk to you about when you come to Israel. It's an opportunity for the African American community to expand the narrative of their existence in North America, part of the legacy of your family. And then Sheis Rishon writes, and here he's writing in reference to what Mordecai ben Avraham said about their history being 100%, the Igbos being 100% descended from Israelites. He says, apparently, that's a debate even among Igbo themselves. And then he writes case in point, and he shares this article from CNN, and then he shared this excerpt, this screenshot, which shares an excerpt from that article, and it states the following. Even among Igbo people, the claim to be Jews elicits strong criticism. One critic, Catherine Ocholonu, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing her surname, one critic, Catherine Ocholonu, attributes Jewish identification among the Igbo as a result of Christianity brought by missionaries, since most Igbo people are Christians. Quote, everybody is excited to say they belong to the people of the Bible because the Bible is reigning. It's in, says Ocholonu, a prominent researcher on Igbo history and culture. In her award-winning book, They Lived Before Adam, Ocholonu proposes that Igbo civilization is older than that of the Israelites. She feels that Igbo people are whitewashing their history and diminishing the value of their own culture by attempting to link their heritage to Jews. And if I could, aside from that, I would recommend a video that appears on the Brother Garfield podcast. It aired in February of 2023. It was a video titled 20 for 20, number 1, Two Igbo Men, Two Different Opinions, Remy Ilona and Medicine Shell. As in that video, the host contrasts Remy Ilona's perspective with that of a different Igbo gentleman, that being the gentleman who runs the Medicine Shell channel, who's similarly steeped in Igbo culture, yet who is not at all convinced about the claims of Israelite heritage. And so what you see is that there are a number of Igbos who are skeptical about these claims of Israelite heritage for the Igbo people. And that's worthy of note. So this is not a universal position even among Igbos, and that's Shace's point. That was the point in his article, and so on. But whatever the case, getting back into the subthread, Rabbi DeMota says, Shace Rishon, this is recent history among Igbos. Have you read the numerous ethnographies before the quote-unquote white man brought his religion to Igbo land? And if I can interject here really quickly, I must confess, I found that statement particularly interesting. If I understand Rabbi DeMota correctly, he seems to be referring to written ethnographies of the Igbo, which were written before the colonial period. If that is indeed what he's referring to, I'd be curious what text he has in mind. Now, I might comment on the thread to attempt to ask him directly, but in the meantime, if Rabbi DeMota or anyone else familiar with this topic could share what texts are being referred to, like, for example, share such in the comment on this video or reach out to me elsewhere on social media, that would be greatly appreciated, because I'm honestly uncertain what he's referring to. But whatever the case, getting back in to this thread, Shace Rishon responds to Mordecai ben Avraham. He says, he's clarifying here, he says, so saying that some tribes negates neither narrative, as those Igbo who reject the Jewish descent narrative might actually not be Jewish, as aligns with the, and then he gives this Hebrew statement, Hapeh she'asar hu hapeh she'hitir, which means roughly the mouth that binds is the mouth that loosens, or the mouth that prohibits something is also the mouth that permits something. But I like the idea of binding and loosing, right? That's the general thought here. Apparently this is some sort of a line or dictum within rabbinic thought, or maybe Jewish law, rabbinic law, I don't know. But it is interesting, because it makes you wonder if he's intends to insinuate that at least some Igbo non-Jews might descend from Igbo Jews. That would also be interesting. But whatever the case, I guess maybe that needs more conversation. But continuing on, Rav Mordecai ben Avraham says, Shace, your argument is only relative to today's basis. The conversation we're having is during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, if you have statistical data on during that specific time, then we have a basis of discussion. And Shace responds, my argument applies to today, the transatlantic slave trade, and before. Also, there is no statistical data in either direction, hence how we're even able to have the question of this argument. Now, if I could comment here really quickly, I have to say that it's interesting that Mordecai Avraham, he made a rather sweeping claim when he said that Igbos are 100% descended from ancient Israelites, and that would raise a question about the statistical data supporting that claim. I seriously doubt that there is serious statistical data in that regard. But without providing such, he just makes the claim, and yet when Shace notes that there is this skepticism amongst Igbos, it's then that Rav Mordecai raises rightly the question of statistical data. And I think it's right for Shace Rishon to point out that we don't seem to have significant statistical data either way, right? Unless we get into genetics, which is a really interesting question. But maybe you can't really get into genetics if it's a halakhic question, because you could descend from someone who's a convert in a halakhic model and be, a part of Israel as well. I don't know. So it's complex. The data question is an open question, and I think that's come out in some of the discussions on Rabbi DeMota's Psak Din. There's a number of videos on that. But whatever the case, getting back into Shace Rishon's comment, he says, we are presented with two different internal narratives for the Igbo. Narrative A, Igbo are not of Jewish descent. Narrative B, all Igbo are Jewish and descended from Edi et al., or etc., and so on, right? And he says, this leaves us with three scenarios. Scenario 1, narrative A is correct. This is untenable given the testaments of Oluwade Equiano et al., and even European Jewish figures. Clearly, there are Igbo with Jewish descent and for centuries before European contact. Scenario 2, narrative B is correct. This creates two possibilities. Possibility 1, it is either wholly correct and those who deny Jewish ancestry are mistaken, or 2, it is incorrect, and not every Igbo is Jewish descended. In the case of possibility 1, given the context and applications of Ketubot 2.5, Yevamot 46b, Ramban in Isurei Bia 1917, Siftei Kohen on the Shulchan Aruch, Even Ezer 2, Bartenura on Kiddushin 4.4, et al., or etc., concerning claims of Jewishness or descent or conversion, halachically, the naysayers would be assumed not to be Jewish, or at least questioned, which leads to the possibility of scenario 3, narrative A and B are both correct, and the people that we have come to know as Igbo are a hybrid group composed of Jewish-descended Africans and local Proto-Igbo, if you will, that became the Igbo group that Europeans later encountered. I think that's a fair scenario. And he says, consider a sci-fi analogy. And I just want to say I love this analogy. He says, consider a sci-fi analogy. Imagine if in 500 years, neighborhoods have evolved their own cultures. And 500 years later, a historian doing due diligence and comparing current and ancient practices determines that anyone descended from the Crown Heights neighborhood is of Jewish descent. Meanwhile, there are other Crown Heights descendants that dispute the narrative and say that they are not of Jewish descent. Is it true that Crown Heights was a Jewish neighborhood? Yes. Are the naysayers correct in saying that they are not of Jewish descent? Yes. Is there a higher chance / percentage that someone Crown Heights descended is Jewish? Yes. Does that mean that all Crown Heights descended people are of Jewish descent? No. If I could, I just want to jump in and say that I really appreciate that analogy. I've attempted to make variations of the same point before. For example, in this tweet from 2022, I offered this analogy. I said, just as the proposition, there were Jews in Western Europe, does not entail the conclusion, therefore Western Europeans are Israelites, so too the proposition, there were Jews in West Africa, does not entail the conclusion, therefore West Africans are Israelites. And we can refine the analogy to make it a smaller territory, a range of people. For example, I'm from New York, and there are lots of Jews in New York, but that doesn't mean that I'm Jewish. And so too, with the same sort of logic, there are lots of Chinese people in New York, but that doesn't mean I'm Chinese, right? I hope you get the point. But I like how Chase refined it even further and to an even smaller point, as he refined it further to a specific neighborhood, that being the Crown Heights neighborhood in Brooklyn, a neighborhood that has lots of people who would be recognized as halachically Jewish by rabbinic Jews, and so too lots of other people who would not be recognized as halachically Jewish by the same rabbinic system. And the idea that there may be descendants of Jews among the Igbo is not absurd, right? A simple recourse to Deuteronomy 28:64 could make that plausible insofar that, Jews or Israelites, however you want to define them, have been spread all over the globe. They've been sprinkled among nigh every population, right? But this leap to what Mordecai ben Avraham was saying, where Igbos are 100% descended from ancient Israelites, that seems to, at the very least, raise questions of how he reached such an extraordinary conclusion, right? And honestly, and with all due respect, I don't think anything from Remy Ilona or Rabbi DeMota or that short conversation with Rabbi Kanievsky, can justify that sort of a conclusion. But just to close out the thread, Shais Rishon finishes it off by saying, at any rate, saying that some Igbo are Jewish descended is unequivocally true and can be confidently stood on regardless of either claim. To say that all are is a tenuous argument to operate from that can be manipulated by bad faith actors on whichever side. And with that, I'll stop here. The conversation itself stopped here. There was no further comment from Mordecai ben Avraham or Rabbi DeMota. And I just simply want to say that this is merely a step in a larger conversation. I just wanted to briefly document and discuss this exchange on Facebook, as I think others might find it interesting. And as always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. Again, I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.